So, Adam, your group is contending that Asian American students are discriminated against by Harvard and some other selective colleges. Yet, when the case went to trial last fall in Boston, you didn't present any of the students who didn't get in or who got in unfairly, and even the judge called your side on that in a little bit. So So, who are these students that you claim were discriminated against, and why didn't you present them at trial to kind of bolster your case? So your case was built on statistics, obviously, but don't you think the human stories would have bolstered it?
There's a multi-layered answer to that question, and the first answer is the judge had previously ruled that we didn't have to do that.
Okay.
So Students for Fair Admissions is a 22,000 member organization, and then we at all times had to prove to the court that we had members who were members of Students for Fair Admissions who had applied to and been rejected from Harvard, and who were still interested in transferring to Harvard. And we would call those our standing members. They established our constitutional standing to be in the case. At the time we get to trial, the main evidence is, in terms of proving the quantity of the discrimination, is, as you mentioned, statistical evidence. Beyond that, of course, we had really a mountain of circumstantial evidence, including internal memoranda where Harvard concluded that itself did have a discrimination problem against Asians and did nothing about it, which is pretty strong circumstantial evidence that it was an intentional result. And to ultimately answer your question as a sort of a matter of strategy, or why didn't we do it, the problem with putting in any individual student is we think about 50 plus Asian American students were rejected each year by Harvard in favor of whites. Whether or not any of our individual members were those students is a sort of imponderable question when you look at all the evidence. And then on top of that...
That wouldn't have been the case in previous affirmative action cases, whether it was Fisher or Bakke or things like that. We always had a face on affirmative action cases.
What the court said in Grutter and going forward is, just participating in a process infected by racial discrimination is itself an injury. And that was what they said in Grutter and in other cases. In our case, we've really proven that a substantial number of Asian students were rejected. We didn't need to put any of our kids up on the stand and have them claim that they themselves were rejected solely or in part because of their race. It just wasn't something the court required us to do.
Okay. So most selective colleges practice holistic admissions that allows them to kind of take a variety of factors into consideration, race being one of them. Your remedy is to take one of those tools away from them, meaning race as one of these factors. I mean, if you're really concerned about bias against Asian Americans, why not just require more training of the admission staff, or maybe hire a more diverse staff? We were talking a little bit earlier about the staff at Harvard, the admission staff at Harvard. Why not just have a more diverse staff?
Well, sure. And to be clear, we've had a trial about liability. Mm-hmm. We've had a trial about whether Harvard, in fact, discriminated against Asian Americans. We think we proved they did. What the court chooses to do, if the court finds liability, is actually up to the court, and of course we'll be there advocating.
Right.
We can't.
But what are you going to be advocating for?
And that's the funny thing about that, is I can't tell you that until I see the court's opinion, because the court may very well say, a series of things that lead us to say Harvard has really abused the use of race in its admissions policy, its admissions process, and the appropriate remedy is to take that tool away from them. But there could be other versions that look very much like what you're advocating, where the court says, no, what we really need is more unconscious bias training. Right. They already have a diverse admission staff, actually, but more training, more awareness. Harvard itself has taken some steps that are obviously designed to combat the discrimination that they have themselves imposed against Asians. They did it right before our trial. They instituted new reading procedures, increased the amount of instruction to their admissions officers by about 800% in terms of the number of words used, and actually said for the first time, don't penalize somebody for being introverted.
Mm-hmm. So if we move away from holistic admissions, which has really been kind of a basis of selective colleges for the last couple of decades, then in your opinion, what should admissions be based on, right? Or should they be based on things that can be measured? Should it just really be around test scores and grades, things that have a numerical figure associated with them? If colleges and universities have to move away from a holistic admissions process, what should they move toward?
Well, it's interesting. I think here I speak for myself, and I think I'm articulating Students for Fair Admissions stance as well. I don't think necessarily holistic admissions has to end. Students for Fair Admissions just says race cannot be a part of that.
Right, but how do you make it race blind? I mean, I've been sitting in the process at 3 selective colleges that all use holistic admissions. So if all you do is take off the student's race off the Common App, students still talk about their background in many other places. There are essays, teachers and counselors talk about it in recommendations. It comes up in their activities. I mean, you know where they went to school, and you have a profile of that school, that high school, right? So it's kind of everywhere throughout the application. How do you make it really race blind?
I think whether a platonic system created where literally no one ever had knowledge of any candidate's race is impossible.
Okay.
But the remedy that I think could be imposed is just, for instance, just taking it off the Common App and doing a sort of Prop 209 or Michigan Civil Rights Initiative style remedy could be imposed. I don't think in California they're totally ignorant of every applicant's race at all times. I seriously doubt that that's true. The interesting thing about your point, though, is Harvard already chooses to eliminate the religion identifier from the Common App. So when you fill out the Common App, you can fill out your religious affiliation. Harvard, by its own choice, blinds itself to what you said there. I'm sure some people discuss religion in their applications as well. And yet what Harvard says is they don't need to consider somebody's religion at all to make sure that they get the diversity they're looking for. It's our position that there's steps they can take that would result in comparable racial diversity on campus, does not require them to consider race just when somebody just checks the box.
Okay, but so you say you do that, then, and say affirmative action is struck down, this case goes, or another case like it goes to the Supreme Court, how do you police that then? Are we just going to see a string of lawsuits going forward where somebody is going to be denied admission and is going to think it's based on on race, and they're going to have to then sue that school in terms of trying to figure out if that's what happened?
Well, so there's sort of two answers to that. One is we live in a system right now where most colleges and universities openly admit that they use race in their admissions, and there's only a handful of lawsuits. Number two, the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights actually exists to investigate those types of complaints, and so we don't need...
Although that depends on who's in office sometimes about how aggressive they are about that.
Well, I think they might be investigating Harvard right now. So in fact, they exist to investigate those kinds of complaints. They've investigated Harvard on a number of occasions and allegations of Asian discrimination, so they would still be around. But I think given the small number of lawsuits we have today, we're not likely to have tons of lawsuits tomorrow. I think people generally will think that the universities are following the law, just like I assume they think that in Michigan and in California.
So you mentioned California and Michigan and Washington, and there have been many other state measures, Florida and elsewhere. How would you ensure campuses are diverse? If there is a post-affirmative action world, how would you ensure that campuses are diverse, or doesn't it matter that they're diverse?
It certainly matters to me,
Okay.
and I would not have taken on the representation. I had a choice about whether to take this case. I'm proud that I took it. I would not have taken it if I thought it was going to result in a significantly less diverse Harvard campus. And here I would defer to Rick Kallenberg, who was our expert and who is probably the nation's leading expert on the use of other tools to achieve diversity on campus that don't involve direct consideration of race. And what he said, and he proved, what we proved, is that if Harvard was simply abandon the privilege preferences for legacies and major donors, that's 30% of the class, those people are 90% white, they effectively are white preferences. If Harvard would get rid of those and institute significant increases in their socioeconomic preferences for disadvantaged students, they would have the same comparable racial diversity that they have today. They'd be much more socioeconomically diverse than they are today, and their academic quality would suffer not at all.
So you agree with banning legacies, legacy status as an admissions?
What I would say is, I think I find it hard to understand the moral justification.
But should there be a ban? Should there be you could actually potentially, should there be a ban on legacy?
Yes. I think we're at the point where the function of these elite institutions in our society is such that if they won't come to that conclusion on their own, then Congress certainly has the power, and it's my personal opinion, it's not the position of Students for Fair Admissions as far as I know, it's my personal opinion that banning legacy and donor preferences would be a great step in reforming higher ed admissions.
How about athletics? We know, especially at selective colleges that are not in Division I, a lot of white students come through athletics as well. How do you change the admission standards around athletes at these schools?
You know, I think the varsity blues thing has turned in, maybe started to convince me to have a little bit of a different view about this. I've never been all that agitated about the athletic preferences because the numbers aren't that high. There just aren't that many athletes. So it's a smaller group. And when we did our race-neutral alternatives plans, we left in the athletes. So in other words,
it's a smaller group, but we know from an academic standpoint, they come in academically behind many students, right?
It's the
bottom of the class.
Yes, you can get an academic 4, which is the lowest academic rating where anyone is admitted to Harvard.
Right.
If you're a recruited athlete,
you're in.
You get you have a 50% chance.
Right.
Overall, athletes have an 86% chance.
And again, these students are overwhelmingly white, so why not change that system as well? If you're trying to ensure diversity, if that's your goal.
I have no objection to it. It's just to me, it doesn't get you where you need to go. You need to do the legacy and donor thing, and personally, I have more of a moral opposition to the legacy and donor thing than I do the athlete thing.
How did you come to this case?
So my close friend, Will Consovoy, of Consovoy McCarthy, filed the lawsuit in 2014. As he got ready for trial, so the case was paused at various moments. About April 2018, he called me and we talked frequently, and he said, "This case is going to go to trial. I'm outgunned. Big law firm on the other side that Harvard has hired, spent millions of dollars on. What do I do?" And I said, "What you really should do is get somebody who's experienced trying cases to try the case with you." 2 weeks later, he called me and said, "I think the person who should do this with me is you." And the very first thing I said is, I really don't think this is for me. This is not the way I want to go down as a lawyer, as potentially the lawyer that helped take down affirmative action. Not because I'm in favor of affirmative action. I'm one of the 4% of respondents to the poll that is actually against affirmative action. It's nice to have a great diverse group here on positions on affirmative action. I saw the poll results. I'm not in favor of affirmative action, but it's never been my passion point. It's just not something that
you may be this lawyer in this case that goes to the Supreme Court.
And so what Will said to me was, "I can't show you the evidence in the case. Trust me. When you see the evidence, you'll think this is something you really were called to do, should be doing." I signed up. I trusted him. You got to trust your friends. I saw the evidence, all the internal evidence. 2 weeks later, I saw it in my office of Harvard's PowerPoints. Is there bias in our admission system? The memos that answer that question, yes. Going to their dean of admissions. If memos like this went to any employer in the country, there'd be a red alert fire alarm, and people would do something. And yet, Harvard did nothing. I walked out of the conference room. I had tears streaming down my face. I went to one of my partners and I said, "I'm so glad I took this case. I am extremely proud to have represented Students for Fair Admissions. This is the most important thing I will ever do as a lawyer."
I want to get to questions from the audience in 1 second. But one question I actually wanted to ask the last panel that I didn't get to ask them. You've obviously been diving deep into admissions over this last couple of years. The system seems to be broken. We talked about legacies, we talked about athletes, things like that. Is there a better way to do college admissions in the US today, especially among selective colleges? We have a lot of ideas out there. Do a lottery system, do a national clearinghouse matching system like we do for medical school graduates going into residency. Are there better ways, in your opinion, of doing college admissions?
I mean,
and then I'll get to questions.
I'm somewhat attracted to something like the lottery system, although it's extremely radical. One thing I don't think is we should ever have a pure sort of SAT-based or test score or exclusively academic admissions model.
So you like the idea of kind of a holistic admissions system?
I think it can be done right. I really do. But I also am not averse to some of these more radical changes. In my view, the problem with Harvard is that racial stereotyping was deployed to harm Asian American applicants. Of that, I have zero doubt.
Let's get to questions from the audience. So do you understand that affirmative action serves and has served to increase equity, and what safeguards would you use to maintain those benefits for other groups?
I think I can't in this time do justice to Justice Thomas's opinion in Grutter, where he would take issue with the premise of the question. And I'd encourage everybody to go and read it, and you can see what he has to say about it. So I take issue with the premise of the question. I don't think necessarily it's been to the great benefit of those people who have been the alleged beneficiaries. But having said that, I think diversity is a great benefit. Socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity. I certainly benefited from racial diversity on the campus of the University of Chicago, where I went to college. And there are ways to get there that do not involve treating individuals differently because of their race.
But every time the use of race in admissions has gone away, we've seen in so many different states and so many different institutions, less diverse classes in the years that followed. I mean, that's a fact.
I think that that's certainly true.
So you could say you're for it, but this is what's happened when we've seen this example in other states.
But I think what you've seen in California, maybe Michigan, is a reticence to deploy radical socioeconomic preferences, the kinds that Rick Kallenberg are proposing. And I think that reticence will go away. Either they'll go away on their own, they'll come to that conclusion on their own. We're talking about big state universities.
Right, so I mean, do you support what Florida and Texas did with a top percent, where they take the top percent of every class?
I think it's a crude tool, but I think it's a perfectly acceptable one. I actually strongly prefer Mr. Kallenberg's approach. And I think Harvard will make that decision. I think take race away from Harvard, they will dial back the privileged preferences so that they can continue to have a racially diverse campus. Harvard is not going to allow itself to have a very low underrepresented minority representation.
But as Tony Jack just brought up in the previous panel, there are a lot of first-generation students and low-income students are also white too. So again, how do you just by using socioeconomic status doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get racial diversity.
It does if you do what Mr. Kallenberg said. I mean, that's what we proved. There's a great model. We did it. It will work.
I want to move on to some more questions here from the audience. Should Asian Americans consider forming their own version of an HBCU to counter alleged discrimination by established institutions like Harvard?
I think the unique position of HBCUs is such that it's not. I don't think Asian Americans should self-segregate like that. I don't think that's a good idea. I think the historic narrative surrounding HBCUs is special.
We were talking about the present administration in terms of its investigative powers. Do you think this case would get the traction if Donald Trump wasn't president?
Well, I think it's inescapable, and it's a matter of public record that Donald Trump has put 2 justices on the Supreme Court of the United States. My able opposing counsel, Seth Waxman, at one point told the court earlier in the case that this whole case was a foregone conclusion unless the next president appointed 2 justices, and that was, I think, in October of 2016, and it happened.
Right.
So
do you think this case will go eventually to the Supreme Court?
I really can't possibly tell you.
Okay. You went to I love it when people bring in people's own personal stories into these things. So you went to the University of Chicago and Cambridge to obtain your education, and as a white male, do you think your privilege helped you get there?
The University of Chicago had like a 50% acceptance rate
At
when I
the time
applied.
you went, yeah.
So it was like,
now it has like 10%.
It's sort of like a coin flip for me. So I'm not sure there's a privilege in a coin flip. And Cambridge, I had a scholarship from the British government, and I don't think the British government's discriminating positively in favor of whites. So I seriously doubt that my white privilege got me to Cambridge. So we can ask the British government, I guess, whether they considered my white privilege.
So what do you tell students who disagree with you, who think race-focused admissions is a critical part of what colleges do to ensure diverse student bodies? When the case started up in Boston, there were a lot of protests for and against, many of them by students. What do you tell the students that you're?
I think what I try to do is achieve common ground. I don't know that many people who defend the legacy and donor preferences, and then what I try to demonstrate is, if we could just agree to get rid of these privilege preferences, we can achieve what it is that you want and what it is that I want without anybody being judged exclusively by the color of their skin.
So are you saying that Harvard could do away with legacy admissions tomorrow if they wanted to, and they're just not doing it, and they will be probably forced to do it if they lose this case?
I think they definitely could do it. They don't want to do it because they like rich people.
Well, we're going to end it on that. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.